Good evening. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the 2025 Ina Levine Annual Lecture, Revoking the Citizenship of Jews in Vichy France. I'm Betsy Anthony, the Director of Visiting Scholar Programs at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. I'm honored to provide an introduction to this endowed lecture, a program of the Mandel Center, and I'd like to begin this evening with special words of thanks to the William S. and Ina Levine Foundation, and in particular, to its founder, Bill Levine. Mr. Levine is a former presidential appointee to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council and a longtime friend and supporter of the museum and the Mandel Center. Tonight's program and many others are due to the generosity of families like the Levines. We are so grateful for their thoughtful support. I'd also like to recognize, yeah, that's good. Thank you. I'd also like to recognize and thank the members of the Mandel Center's Academic Advisory Board, our academic committee, some of whom are in our audience today. We're also very grateful for your service and commitment to the museum and the Mandel Center and are happy to have you here in person with us this evening. And now I'm honored to introduce tonight's speaker. For the past 7 months, we at the Mandel Center have had the distinct pleasure of hosting Professor Claire Zalc as our 2024-2025 Ina Levine Invitational Scholar. We're also excited that we'll have her here for another 2 months into the summer. Dr. Zalc is the research director at the CNRS, the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, and a professor at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, also in Paris. Her research focuses on the relationship between the history of migration and the Holocaust, and she's written on topics such as business and entrepreneurship, immigration in France, and the history of persecution during the Vichy Regime. Dr. Zalc has authored numerous publications, including the book Denaturalized: How Thousands Lost Their Citizenship and Lives in Vichy France, for which she was awarded the 2016 Malzerbe History of Justice Book Prize, and honorable mention for the 2022 Eugen Weber Book Prize. She also co-edited the 2016 book Microhistories of the Holocaust. Dr. Zalc serves on the editorial boards for a number of academic journals and is the principal investigator of the Lubert World Project. Professor Zalc's lecture will be followed by a discussion and Q&A with Mandel Center Director Lisa Leff. The index cards you received as you entered the auditorium were provided for you to write questions that you can turn in to our colleagues who will collect them when that time comes. And after the lecture, you are, as always, invited to a reception in the museum's Hall of Witness to meet with Professor Zalc and our other guests. And now I'm pleased to introduce the Mandel Center's Ina Levine Invitational Scholar, Professor Claire Zalc, as she delivers her lecture, Revoking the Citizenship of Jews in Vichy France. Please join me in welcoming Professor Zalc to the podium.
Thank you, Betsy. And to begin, I would like to thank all the members of the Mandel Center, and especially Betsy for this very kind introduction, Lisa, who is going to help as a moderator, and Jocelyn for everything, for the incredible opportunity they've given me through this invitation to serve as the Ina Levine Senior Fellow this year. I would also like to express my heartfelt thanks to Bill Levine, whose generous support in memory of his wife, Ina, made this fellowship possible. I'm honored to hold a position that carries such a meaningful legacy. I would also like to thank all the fellows. Who are they? There. With whom I've shared wonderful conversations and very fun times during my stay. You've all made my stay and my time in DC at the Holocaust Museum an incredible human and intellectual experience. And last but not least, I want to thank my closest friends and loved ones who made the trip, some from Atlanta, New York, and even Paris, to be here with me today. Thanks. I will begin this talk by invoking the legacy of the historian Marc Bloch, one of the founders of the Annales School of Historical Thought. In 1940, he lost his position at the University of Strasbourg because he was Jewish. He went into hiding, joined the resistance network in Lyon, and was later arrested, tortured, and executed by the Germans on June 16, 1944. Among the writings he left behind is an unfinished but powerful work, Apologie pour l'Histoire, written during the war, translated into English as the historian's craft, but this is not very accurate. It has become a foundational text, almost a Bible for the discipline of history. In it, Bloch reminds us how deeply history is tied to the present. To quote him, "Misunderstanding of the present is inevitably born of ignorance of the past. but it may be no less futile to exhaust oneself trying to understand the past if one knows nothing of the present. In his essay, The Strange Defeat, L'étrange défaite, he observed France's collapse in 1940 like an ethnographer, capturing its meaning in real time and became active in the resistance. He wrote again, I'm quoting, "Ignorance of the past does not merely impair our knowledge of the present, it compromises action in the present." The episode of denaturalizations conducted in France under Vichy between 1940 and 1944 provides some points for reflection, both to point out the differences between the current context and the past, and to make us vigilant about the potential consequences of depriving people of the right to have rights. This is what the story of another Marc Chagall, reminds us. Marc Chagall was born in 1889 in Vitebsk, which was then part of the Russian Empire and is now in Belarus. A gifted young painter, he moved to Paris in 1910 at the age of 23 and settled in Montmartre, just below Chaim Soutin's studio. In 1914, Chagall returned to Russia to marry Bella, but the declaration of war and the revolution trapped him there. He tried to start an art school in Moscow, but felt completely out of space. I'm quoting, "Neither Imperial Russia nor the Russia of the Soviets needs me. They don't understand me. I am a stranger to them." In 1923, he returned to France with his wife and daughter, Ida. He later wrote, quote again, "In Paris, I felt reborn." This marked the beginning of his deep connections with France, depicted in many of his paintings. He applied for French citizenship and was granted it on June 4, 1937. In spring 1940, as the German army advanced and the French army collapsed during the famous Strange Defeat, so well described by the other Marc Bloch, Chagall and his wife fled south to the unoccupied zone. They settled in Gordes when they bought a small 17th century house. Chagall felt secure with his French citizenship, but his friends, especially Americans, were worried. Varian Fry, with the Emergency Rescue Committee, was tasked with assisting intellectuals and dissidents in fleeing France. In December 1940, he met with Chagall to discuss his escape, and you can see the photograph in the museum collection. The Museum of Modern Art in New York had requested an emergency visa for him, but it took the State Department more than 3 months to process it. In March 1941, Fry traveled to Gordes to help finalize the plan. In May, Marc and Bella Chagall fled to Lisbon via Spain. In June, they boarded the SS Musinho headed to the United States. A notable film in the museum's collections captures the boat's departure, filled with hundreds of Jewish refugee children rescued from internment camp in unoccupied France by the Jewish Distribution Committee. Chagall and his wife are visible among them. This episode, Chagall's escape, one of Varian Fry's most remarkable rescue missions, is well known. But what is less known is that at the very same time, in Paris, the Vichy administration was quietly working on his case. In 1943, a decree published in the Journal Officiel officially stripped Marc Chagall of his French nationality. As you can read, we, Marshal of France, head of the French state, following the law of July 22, 1940, relating to the review of naturalizations, decree that French citizenship is withdrawn from Marc Chagall, among a list of a lot of others, as you can see. This part of his life remains largely in the shadows. Why this silence? Why was his citizenship revoked? How did it happen, and what were the consequences? By 1943, Chagall was already in New York. But what about the others, the ones who couldn't leave? These are the questions I would like to answer today. To do so, we first need to take a closer look at the legal framework. The law of July 22, 1940 was launched by the Vichy Regime during its first days of existence. After the defeat of France and the signing of the armistice with Germany, Marshal Pétain, that you can see here, became the head of the French state, l'État français, the new regime that succeeded the Third Republic on July 10, 1940. He immediately intended to make denaturalization one of the central pillars of his policy. The law was promulgated 12 days after he came to power. The review of naturalization has been a top priority and a centerpiece of his national revolution policy, summed up by the slogan, France for the French, la France aux Français. Yet in the end, we know little about these denaturalizations. The bibliography remains quite slight. Why is this so? This relative ignorance results from silence on two fronts. First, there is the silence of the law. Here, I'm reproducing the entirety of the text of the law of July 22, 1940, which gave the order for denaturalizations. I am setting law in quotes because it was not voted by any deputies, as the French state of Pétain dissolved the assembly. No regular laws were voted. It's much more, if you may, like an executive order. It is short, simple, and most importantly, you can observe that he remains completely silent regarding the criteria that were supposed to guide decisions. No target is mentioned in any manner. Neither crime nor offense is specified. The only thing the text said is that, I'm quoting, a review of all acquisitions will be conducted. No need to call for an offense here. It is just a total review of all the naturalization given from 1927. Why 27? Why 1927? This that was not chosen at random. It referred to the law of August 10, 1927, which is considered the most open law in the history of French nationality because it lowered the residency requirement in France to 3 years instead of 10 before. The second major handicap is that the Commission of the Review of Naturalization, which was the institution established by this law to carry out the policy in Article 2, as you can see, a commission has been established for this purpose, left no archives. One main reason for this is the presence on the commission of André Mornet, who had a particularly controversial and distinguished career after the war. You can see him. He served as the vice president of the Commission on the Review of Naturalization from 1940 to 1944, but he's best known for being appointed by Général de Gaulle as prosecutor for the Haute Cour de Justice after the war, which meant that he was in charge of the post-war purge of judges who were accused of collaboration. He oversaw the Laval and Pétain trials after the war, as you can see here. One can surmise that he didn't want to leave behind the traces of his own activity as a member of the commission. So, the challenge is to provide an account of a policy that neither named its targets nor left behind deliberate archives. No written guidelines exist to explain the principle that guided their work. This dual absence of archives and criteria has made for a fascinating study based on the very actions on the administrative practice. Because there are some traces. But to find them, you have to open the naturalization files themselves. each naturalization file from 1927 to 1940 includes a slip, as you can see, many of them here, attached to the cover that indicates the Commission's decision: maintain, withdrawal, inquiry. There is very often the name of the Commission's review, as you can see here, who sometimes left a note inside, as you can see here for Chagall. This is the small note found in Chagall's file saying, I'm quoting, because of the notoriety of the person concerned, recommends to carry out an investigation. He was quite prudent. They collectively represent an enormous archive, as the Commission reopened around 250,000 to 300,000 files from September 1940 to August 1944. And since the files are family-based, the number of people affected is closer to about 850,000 to 1 million. This is where my appetite for numbers can be a good thing. Let me reassure you, I didn't open all 250,000 files. I'm only human. Instead, I selected and examined a sample of 1,000 of them. I immersed myself in the inner workings of administrative practices to conduct a kind of archival ethnography of the traces left by these procedures. In a nutshell, I attempted to carry out a quantified ethnography of the files. To understand how the denaturalization process occurred, it is important to grasp how the reviewers concretely worked. That is why I want to show you the basic materials of their daily work, which refers to the naturalization file. And let's take a look together at Chagall's file, which I was able to find in the National Archives. Chagall submitted his application in 1927 with support from Marshal Joffre and Léon Blum, we will become next the Prime Minister of France in 1936. Present in France since 1923, as I told before, Chagall was able to apply in 1928, 5 years later, thanks to the 1927 law. But his first application was postponed. He was considered too old at 41. It doesn't make me feel any younger. In 1932, he tried again. Despite the 1933 report by the French secret police noting that his paintings had been burned during Hitler's rise, the Ministry of Justice rejected him, claiming his qualifications were insufficient. In 1935, as you can see there, he had to apply for a third time. Yet, the representative from the Ministry of Justice, Combier, rejected him, stating, I'm quoting, I do not attach any interest from a French point of view to his artistic work, which seems too far removed from the French tradition to be able to enrich it. Nevertheless, after the electoral victory of the left wing and the appointment of Léon Blum as Prime Minister of the Popular Front in 1936, Chagall was finally granted French citizenship on June 4, 1937, after more than 10 years of delays. However, 3 years later, on October 10, 1940, under the Vichy regime, in the same file, I found a notice of the Commission recommending revoking his French nationality. In the eyes of the Vichy administration, I don't know if you can notice, he was no longer Marc Chagall, but Moïse. The reason indicated on the slip is Russian Israelite, nationality not in national interest. This leads to the first issue raised by this lecture. Who is a good or the bad citizen under the Vichy regime? The issue is not just how the Vichy regime defined them, but also how the administration concretely differentiates between good and bad citizens. Because behind the Vichy administration, there are individuals. They held considerable power as the legislature no longer existed after July 10, 1940. And as the law, as we have seen, did not mention any target. This is why this topic serves as a valuable lens for understanding the boundary between the power of judges versus the power of law. There is a philosophical and theoretical debate concerning this distinction, going back to the 18th century. Beccaria, César Beccaria, argued that the law must be as specific as possible to protect against arbitrariness. On the other side, Diderot defended the opposite view, arguing that the freedom given to the judge is the best way to fight the authoritarianism of the sovereign. Beyond this debate, the question concerns the relationship between routine administrative work and ideology. When and how does the power of an ordinary administration get to be used in the service of an ideology? How does violence play out in ordinary power relations? With these questions in mind, let's look at the criteria used by the Commission to select people for denaturalization. First, the denaturalization policy was an attack on the former Republican regime, particularly targeting the Popular Front. The symbolism was clear, as in September 1940, the Commission began by examining the files of individuals naturalized, not in 1927, not in 1939, but in 1936. Therefore, it was a priority to reverse the actions taken by the Popular Front, and Chagall, naturalized in 1937, was particularly at risk. Moreover, the aim was to punish all individuals who benefited from a recommendation under the Third Republic. It was customary for local elected officials of the Third Republic to support a whole series of individuals' requests by sending letters, and we saw it in Chagall's file, with letters from Blum, Marshal Roth, and there is a lot of others that I didn't mention. Tracking down recommendations also addressed a practical concern on the reviewers of the Commission, because they are relatively easy to identify when examining files. They took a concrete material form that could easily be seen when opening the file sleeve. Support letters here, a note mentioning a telephone call, or even a capital R stamped in purple on the front cover, R for recommendation, or double R for strong recommendation, as you can see here on Chagall's cover. So that was quite easy to note. And the letters of recommendation that had been slipped into the file subsequently brought punishment. This letter, penned in 1930 by Paul Poncet, the socialist representative for the Seine, in support for a request, was literally glued to the Commission slip that notified of the withdrawal, as if to display the proof of an ill-gotten nationality. The second criterion is relative to the Jews, even if, strictly speaking, the denaturalization policy is not an anti-Semitic policy, since it does not mention Jews. It is important to recall that because of secularism, the French Republican administration ignored Jewish identity. Religion has disappeared from the census in 1872 during the early years of the Third Republic. Neither religious nor racial belonging appeared in the Republic's records. They could not base themselves on the file of naturalized Jews because no such files existed. And yet, as the Chagall case demonstrates, they targeted Jews. So how? See here. The reviewer came up with an onomastic solution. They identified Jews using first and last name. And that is why Chagall became Moïse. On Abramovich's file, there is this comment, Romanian Israelite doctor. This file, moreover, was examined on September 28, 1940. And the date is very important because it was before the Vichy regime adopted the first statute on Jews on October 3, 1940. It is important to note that this anti-Semitic identification preceded the implementation of anti-Semitic legislation and its definitions of Jews. The Commission established the objective of denaturalizing Jews as a priority before the statute was enacted. In other terms, it complied in advance with what was expected, and this was not imposed by German authorities. This objective was not shared by all. The Abram family of Grenoble was denaturalized on October 27, 1942, most likely because of the sound of their last name, which was similar to Abraham family. But this decision appeared to be incomprehensible for the agent at the Grenoble prefecture. He added the comment, reasons unknown, when registering the decision. That leads me to say that many local actors intervened alongside members of the Commission, including street-level bureaucrats in prefecture, police officers, mayors, neighbors, employers. They were asked to carry out investigations, as well as to point out the bad French to be denaturalized as a priority. Their actions were sometimes decisive, and one can observe many discrepancies between the ideological intentions of the Vichy regime and the local implementation of the policy at the ground level. For instance, in Grenoble, the first individuals subjected to denaturalization were chiefly communists. But in the Vaucluse department, sex and all moral offenders, according to the Vichy definition, are particularly targeted, in particular, homosexuals. But unlike the Vaucluse, sex and moral offenses, and either politics reasons, in Pas-de-Calais, Jews were the main target. Consequently, the question is how the degree of freedom was used. This is a crucial point to recall that behind the big words, a regime, a state, an administration, there are also individuals, and they have substantial power. The history of denaturalizations opens up a field of investigation that questions the consequences of the room for maneuver in authoritarian regimes. The power to decide is not easy to wield, as judges sometimes hesitated. In this naturalization file, I found a small sheet of paper. Paper was in a rare supply during the wartime shortage. And the judge wrote the name of the individual, Ashkenazi, then the country of origin, Turkish, and asked himself, Israel? Question mark. He seems certainly confused by a last name that definitely sounds Jewish, Ashkenazi, but with a previous citizenship that for him did not relate to this name, Turkish. It appears as though the judge was ill at ease. He asked for an inquiry. To weigh how this room for maneuver played, I tried to count and measure what played a role in the Commission's decision. Professional status was clearly a discriminating factor during review procedures. Independent professions were the subject of great suspicion, in keeping with the press campaigns of the 30s against the, I'm quoting, unfair competition of foreign artisans and shopkeepers. Tailors were the subject of specific treatment. The common anti-Semitic presupposition that associated tailoring with Jewish immigration was at the origin of this discrimination. Birthplace was also particularly determinant. Naturalized individuals born in Eastern Europe were discriminated again. evaluations carried a heavy dose of anti-Semitism. Professional characterization and place of origins become established as a euphemized form of anti-Semitic identification. Here, a Romanian-born doctor named Abramovich was off a bad start. More surprising is another effect, which appears very clearly. Statistically, the person of the judge. One of the main findings from studying statistically the denaturalization criteria is that all other things being equal, the rapporteur, the judge reviewing each case, had a significant influence on the outcome. The risk varied markedly depending on who was examining the file. Some judges were overt collaborators, actively hunting down Jews in records to identify their origins, while others adopted a more lenient approach, slowing their pace and increasing the number of rulings that maintained the status quo, effectively engaging in a form of underground resistance. So the question is, who were the men? Not that the staff was exclusively male in charge. The creation of a new commission by the Vichy regime demonstrated a clear desire for a political break from the Republic. But despite the appearance of the break from the past, a closer look at the members reveals a strong sense of continuity. All the members of the commission were judges from the elite circles of the Third Republic. At his head was Jean-Marie Roussel, a seasoned senior civil servant and a member of the Council of State, le Conseil d'État. He was assisted by Raymond Bacquard, another state councillor and former director of personnel at the Ministry of Justice, and André Mornet, this famous magistrate that I already mentioned, who was known as the prosecutor of death because he was the prosecutor who had Mata Hari sentenced to death during World War I. Moreover, 3/4 of the commission members had previously worked in the naturalization service under the Third Republic. Do you remember Combier, who examined Chagall's case in 1937? He worked during Vichy as a reviewer in the commission, and I found his signature a lot of time. This raises the interesting question of the motives. Do the members of the commission need to be motivated to denaturalize someone? Some of them volunteer their services, notably retired judges, but for the most part, the lines between personal convictions and obedience to orders remain blurred. In the summer of 1941, all French civil servants were required to take an oath of allegiance to Marshal Pétain. Only one judge in all of France, Paul Didier, refused to take the oath. Interestingly, he had been heading the naturalization office at the Ministry of Justice since 1937. After his refusal, he was removed from his position and demoted to a simple judge as punishment for his resistance to the regime's policies. But his disgrace serves as an implicit reminder that it was possible to oppose the regime. The significance of individual variations in applying the denaturalization law highlights that there are diverse ways of complying with orders, opportunities for circumventions, and adaptations to constraints that largely depend on one's socialization. Of course, the role of time and of chronology is crucial. The decision to revoke citizenship had different implications depending on when it was taken. For example, a decision made in the fall of 1940 reflected support for Marshal Pétain's effort to, I'm quoting, purify the national community, whereas a decision made in the summer of 1942, when the final solution was being implemented, with thousands of Jews being deported to Auschwitz from France every day, had a far more serious connotation. This brings me to the next point of this presentation, the crucial question of the connection between denaturalization and the implementation of the Holocaust in France. There is, as you may know, a huge debate in France. Some columnists argued that the Vichy regime intended to protect French Jews. The debate is around Marshal Pétain's refusal to sign a bill that would have collectively denaturalized all French Jews. So he refused to sign this bill as he was being pressured to do so in August 1943 by the occupying German authorities. A closer look shows the opposite. It was not at all to protect French Jews. For over 5 years, denaturalizations exposed French Jews to police scrutiny, investigations, and arrests. Look at this case. The chronology of events is very often tight, as it shows. Revocation of citizenship, March 20, 1942. As you can see, retrait de nationalité, décret du 20 mars 1942. Notification of the loss had to be given in person. Moïse Abramovich was called to the police station. On April 29, 1942, as you can see, he was transferred to the occupied authorities, remis aux autorités d'occupation. Then he was, as you can see, interned in the Drancy camp and deported in June 1942. Denaturalization deprived him of the relative protection offered by French citizenship, and in this sense, this policy actively contributed to the Vichy regime's implementation of the Holocaust in France. But more than that, every time an order was given to denaturalize, the police came to their home and contributed to making them more vulnerable. That is why Pétain's refusal in August 1943 to denaturalize collectively the Jews is not a gesture towards French Jews, but in the context of the political stakes of citizenship to keep control of the nationality policy. This highly sensitive element of sovereignty and independence, especially after the German occupation of the Free Zone, the so-called Free Zone, in November 1942. This is a proof of it. In 1943, as the pressure to sign reached its peak, Pétain asked the Commission to provide the number of Jews that had been denaturalized. His negotiations with the Germans were to prove that Jews were the target population of the denaturalization policy. He consequently asked the reviewer to provide the number of denaturalized Jews. This made the Commission members uncomfortable because they replied that they could not provide such a number. In fact, as we saw previously, Jewish origin is nowhere mentioned in the file. But Pétain insisted. So this is what the Commission did in August 1943. They opened one by one all the records they had produced, and one by one identified the individuals as Jews or non-Jews. Look here, this is mentioned in the top right corner, Juive. Pétain needed this number to show the German that his priority was to denaturalize the Jews. However, this September 1943 month is a kind of change, because from this point, we cannot first attempt to delay the procedures inside the Commission. In a note dated September 24, 1943, the Secretary of the Commission wrote that regarding Jews, the Commission would only propose revocation for individuals, I'm quoting, whose current address was unknown. That was the case of Chagall, because he was in the state. This provided little protection and came too late, but because by that date, more than 30,000 Jews had already been deported from France to the killing centers. But the paradox lies, moreover, in the disconnect between the officials' action and their consequences. To delay the process, the Commission ordered investigations in the prefecture. The judges deferred and delegated responsibilities, multiplying investigations through other state agencies. And the effect of these investigations was to provoke searches and thus make Jews who were trying to hide even more vulnerable. In doing so, they actively participated in the extermination machinery by dispatching police commissioners to search for individuals attempting to hide. And this report is just preceding 2 days before Leon Ashkenazi was arrested and then deported. So, to end, I would like to give you an idea of the itineraries of these individuals after their denaturalization. First, as we saw, they were called in by the police to be notified of the decision. As part of this humiliating ceremony, they had to give back their ID papers. And that is why I found many of them in the archives, including this one. This person, Hilda Carasso, lost her job as a teacher, as many civil servants and municipal employees' jobs were reserved for national citizens. Veterans lost their pension, and many of them had served as Frenchmen in the army during the campaign of 1940. At this point, we can see what nationality is concretely represented. It was a matter of status, political and national, but also economic and social and symbolic. The denaturalized reacted when faced with such difficulties. 30% of them wrote a protest letter of some kind. These letters are very emotional and interesting material. They show how people internalized the definitions of what it meant to be a good French person under the Vichy regime. One can observe what I have called the grammar of Frenchness, in which they expressed the French quality they thought that was expected at this time. Clara Abramovich wrote the president of the Review Commission on September 1942 to ask him to reconsider the nationality withdrawal decision that had struck her entire family on 21 June 1941. I'm quoting. On 20 August 1941, my husband was sent as a Jew to the Drancy camp and from there to Compiègne, where he was sent by the occupying authorities as of 10 June 1942 to a destination I do not know. And since that date, I have been without any news. For my children and myself, it is a separation that makes us very unhappy and sad. I have always spoken the French language and brought up my children in the love of France. I beg you urgently, Mr. President, to be so kind as to note that with all my heart, I desire ardently to keep French nationality for us all, and I dearly hope that you will give a favorable outcome to my request. The Commission asked for an investigation to provide background for this request. The report of the Paris police préfet, dated March 1943, concluded laconically, I'm quoting, although the concerned party and her family have been the objects of no unfavorable notice, I judge, for my part, that their return to the French community presents no interest. Clara Abramovich was deported to Majdanek by convoy number 50 leaving from Drancy on March 1943, the same month. Her older son, Isher, 17, was arrested and deported by convoy number 58 on July 31, 1943, to Auschwitz. They did not return. Approximately 15,000 people were stripped of their French citizenship. between 1940 and 1944. Among them, it is estimated that 1/3 were Jewish. When the names of those stripped of their citizenship are cross-references with the names on the transport lists, more than 900 people are found to have been deported. What is the end of this story? One can distinguish 3 different heads. First, the May 24, 1944 ordinance by the French Committee for the National Liberation in Algiers repealed the law of July 22, 1940. But that was neither simple nor easy. It was a major subject of debate within Free France. In September 1943, François de Morton said he was in favor of keeping the law because the naturalization policy of the Third Republic was much too liberal. He ultimately renounced this position due to the firm intervention in the debate of René Cassin, who argued how necessary it was to repeal such a law. The second end of the story could be dated on August 18, 1944. That is the last date on which the Commission met and worked. August 18, until the very last days of the war, and just 1 week before the liberation of Paris. Remember, the debarkment is June 6, 1944. The reviewers continued to review and to withdraw. The third ending date is less precise but more surprising. The story actually continued after liberation, as you can see here in Chagall's file. It's dated February 1945. The administration, which had stayed in the same offices, could not pursue without resistance the cancellation of the huge amount of work it had accomplished over 5 whole years. So, as you can see in this slide, all of the files of those who were denaturalized were once again examined by the Ministry of Justice to see if they will cancel or not the decision. And that, for me, was very surprising. On the ground level, on the denaturalized themselves, the end of the story did not yet mean formal notification. They were not informed of anything. Nobody returned their papers. In the files, one often finds letters in the 50s, even in the 60s, asking, in the end, am I French or not? The story shows what nationality concretely represented for people by studying the situations of those who lost it, sometimes for a while and sometimes forever. To conclude, the study of denaturalizations under Vichy regime raises questions about ordinary power relations. I speak of ordinary power relations to include practices which are in no way extraordinary. Opening a file, doodling a word, scribbling a note, stamping a date, writing a letter. Turning a blind eye, continuing to denaturalize the spouses and children of deportees, and disregarding the repercussion of their actions, believing them to be commonplace, illustrated the various arts of collaboration that existed. There are no murders or executions here. Here are no heroic or spectacular interventions, but there are men, women, and children who lost their nationality from one day to the next. And for some of them, they led to the loss of their lives. And that is why I will conclude with the words of Marc Bloch, with which I began. Ignorance of the past does not merely impair our knowledge of the present, it compromises action in the present. Thank you.
Okay, that was such a rich talk. Thank you, Claire. And it's been such a pleasure to have you here this year because of the level. You have a way of toggling back and forth between big questions, big implications, and the small details that really allow us to evaluate how something like this worked. I want to say to the audience, I'm sure you have questions. The way we're going to handle that is have you write them on the cards that you got when you came in, and then pass them to the end, and our staff will bring them up to me. And one of the benefits of doing it this way is it takes a little while, so I get to ask my questions. Claire, one of the words you used towards the end was collaboration, which is often how we talk about the occupation of France, and obviously it's the formal policy of the French state vis-a-vis the Germans. But I note here in your talk how little the Germans appear. In what way does this tell us something about the French leadership attitude towards the Germans? What are they? How is this part of the policy of trying to, proactively please the Germans versus accomplishing a policy that maybe people in this in Pétain's circle wanted to accomplish anyway, with or without the Germans?
I'm answering right now.
Please answer my
question. Thank you for the question. Okay, that is why I'm so interested in these policies, because it was not imposed at all by the Germans. And I'm almost sure they did not anticipated even the Germans' expectations when they did this law 12 days after Marshal Pétain came into power. That means something. He has a whole policy, which is a xenophobic policy. And because there is no identification of Jews, he cannot say it's anti-Semitic, but anti-Semitism is everywhere. And so this is really a nationalist policy, authoritarian state, but it's not imposed by the German. And I have a lot of examples that denaturalizations were made all over Europe. I mean, of course, Germany denaturalized in Germany, but there were also denaturalization in Poland, in Turkey, there were denaturalization. I mean, it was the whole things to define who is a good citizen and what is a loyalty to the state. So what is very important here and what is very interesting to study is what is a loyal person when the state is occupied by another power state. So, for example, I loved studying the denaturalization of German because there were sometimes too German to be loyal to France, but they were not at ease to denaturalize German. So that was for Italian, fascist Italian also. So they didn't really know how to do. For communist Italian, it was very easy, but for fascist Italian, who had, for example, a Mussolini poster in his house, so the mayor denounced him as not a good citizen because he has Mussolini in his house. But the commission said, yeah, okay, but, well, okay. So, and finally, they didn't denaturalize him. So what is loyalty in this case? So that was important. And you're right, Germans are not very present in my story because they are not very present in the denaturalization policy. When they tried, he refused them to impose something. And I'm pretty sure that here there is a conflict between the way of dealing with nationality between Germany and France. France is a reign of discretionary power. I mean, it's very well documented, meaning that the civil servant has a power to say you are or not French, or you will become French. But for Germans, it's much more criteria policy. So they have criterion. It's not someone who is deciding. If you have the criteria, you will be German. So.
I see Jocelyn is coming with the cards. Okay, first question. What happened to people who had been denaturalized when they tried to return to France or remain there? So after, what happened to them?
Okay, so that is first they became foreigners again. So they had to comply to all the things which was imposed to foreigners. And for a lot of them, they were not belonging to any other nation, like Polish, for example. They were denaturalized from Poland, and they were naturalized French, but denaturalized. So they became apatride. And
which means stateless, yeah?
Yeah, stateless, exactly. And so for a lot of them, they were put in internment camps for foreign persons, not all of them, but they had to comply, to comply to all the measures related to foreigners. And they did not automatically get their former citizenship back, if this is the question. That is also interesting because, for example, for Italy refused, saying, I don't want those Italians who are a lot of anti-fascist Italians. We don't want them. So there were no more Italian, no more French, and so they became stateless.
Well, I have you talking about these trajectories. Did you fully close the loop about Chagall? Did he ever even learn that he had been denaturalized if by 1943 he's gone, right?
He's gone. He's coming back in 1947 or 48 in France. And what his son says that he never knew. He never knew he was denaturalized because he was not notified. He was abroad. And when he came back, he was loving France and painting the ceilings of the opera. And he didn't know.
He didn't even know.
No. So we found it in the archives. That was quite a discovery. But there is not just Chagall. For example, the father of Serge Gainsbourg was also denaturalized. And Serge Gainsbourg did not mention, a lot of persons did not mention, Jacques Derrida was denaturalized.
But he knew.
Yeah, because he was Algerian, so he was denaturalized as a part of, it was known. But for some of them, they didn't know.
Wow. Okay, I have a very good one here. You referred to cross-referencing the names from the files with names from the transport lists. Were you also able to cross-reference these names with other primary sources to get a better sense of how many of those identified as Jews by the Commission actually saw themselves as Jewish?
That's an excellent question, and it's very, very hard in any kind of sources to see if someone identifies him or herself as Jew. Mark Bloch is the best example, and I will answer with him. He says that he was never publicly saying something about his Jewishness, but when he was excluded from his position at the University of Strasbourg, he realized that he was Jewish. And so that was really the moment he was totally assimilated. He didn't do any kind of tradition, but then he was excluded from his job. And that is the moment where he realized, and so he has very good sentence in his books about that, about trying to get and to understand what it means for him now, and he does not understand, because for him he's a historian, he's an intellectual, he's not, and this is part of his intimacy. So yeah, I'm crossing a lot of other sources, but it's very hard to answer this question. This is a very big question. And
And it really, your answer really shows how fluid these identities are. And this really connects to the next question that I got. Did these investigations also compromise the safety of French Jews? That is to say, in English, we call them native-born French Jews, who may have been married or otherwise associated with foreign or stateless Jews. So that, one of the things I really like about your talk is how it kind of calls into question this distinction that we often make between the so-called foreign Jews and the so-called French Jews. You're kind of collapsing that with this category. This question is pushing even farther, saying, what about so-called native Jews who might have married naturalized? Was their safety also compromised by this process?
I'm not really going to answer these questions because for me, naturalized Jews are French Jews. They are French Jews. I mean, the law say they are French. So I don't know what is native or not native. And more than that, children, I mean, when you see all together the country of birth for the all denaturalized person, you know what is the first one in all the country of birth? France. Because of the children. So they were denaturalized and they were all native because they were born in France. So that is the first the ranking, in the ranking, it's the first country. So that does not really make sense because I mean, it's really a matter of the border of the law. Are you in or are you out? And for a lot of, if you were linked to any kind of naturalized person, you will be denaturalized because the naturalizations policy is really a family-based policy. So when you are any kind of children, all the children, for example, Chagall, his daughter, Ida, was denaturalized. Of course, his wife was denaturalized. Okay, that is not native one because Ida was born in Russia and Bella also, but I mean, that not make any differences for the judges.
Yeah, I mean, this does really collapse. We used to, in the historiography, scholars are really used to making this distinction, and you really are pushing us beyond that. And I think that's a really important part of this work. I also just want to, I'm interrupting the cards with one of my own questions. Can you put that law of 1927 in kind of global perspective for us? How, compared to other democracies in 1927, how different is the French law that allows people to become naturalized after 3 years of living in the country? Is that normal? Is that very atypical? It sounds like in France, it was seen as, at least, 14 years later, it's seen as going too far. How does it fit into the scheme of naturalization laws in the world?
So I don't think the historian is a good one to say what is normal or not, but just to observe and to understand. And it's perfectly understandable why the 1927 law required such a lower residence of 3 years. Why? Because France needed persons. I mean, they wanted to have more French. Why? Because first, they have this demographic very low increase comparing to the other countries. So that was a big issue. Second, that need really to have more persons to be in the army. That's why Chagall was too old. 41 was too old because he was not mobilized in case of. So they need, when you see the files, if you have 3 daughters, you don't have a very good chance to get your naturalization. But if you have 3 sons, you got directly your naturalization. They really want to have more French male to just be in the army. I mean, that was really, they wanted to have more naturalized persons. So this is first for the army. The second thing is for demographic and what we call in France populationist, meaning all the persons who are saying, and Macron now is saying that also, that we need to make more babies, to have, I mean, the force of a country is a number of the person from this country. And France had an issue with that because it stayed 40 million of inhabitants for half a century. So they really needed to have more things. And the third reason was, of course, 1.5 million of deaths during World War I, mainly men. So they needed to just make more French persons in the nation. So, I mean, it was not to be nice. They just needed them. They needed them to just, and that we always forget that. We say that it's nice to give it's like an honor to give the naturalization. Not at all. They just needed to have more persons. So they did the law for them. For the nation, for this kind of economical reason. So I don't know. For me, I as a citizen, I can say that it's perfectly normal. I mean, I should make, but that is my political statement. It's not as a historian.
Yes, no, I just meant as a historian compared, like, I know the United States was limiting immigration greatly in that same period, were other European democracies in the 1920s allowing naturalization. They too had been through World War I and had losses.
France was not as the other European democracies at all, because of the closure of the doors of the United States, they got a lot of new immigrants who choose France because they were seeking to have more persons. That is why they preferred to be them naturalized than to have this huge immigration. So that was related to the global policy of migrations, for sure.
Very helpful. And then will you say something about the fights in the 1930s, you know, which you kind of refer to in your talk, that made it so that as soon as Pétain comes in, the very, you know, within 2 weeks, he's done this.
So everything changed with the economic crisis. Because as soon as the economic crisis came, in the beginning of the 30s, immigrants and new French became a danger, a threat, because they were taking jobs for the real French. So the right wing became to be very focused on this La France aux Français, which is a slogan born there, which is quite interesting because now it's a slogan of the Rassemblement National, as you may know. And so that was really, the economic crisis was a turning point, if you want to. And then, again, 1 million of unemployed persons. So they just tried first to, and they did it, to send immigrants back to their countries. And they did it very actively. And then there were all these suspicions about this new French who could be a threat to the other one. So that is really, I think, linked to the economic crisis in France. Then there is a whole global anti-Semitic crisis in the 30s, also linked to economic crisis, I think, that you can observe in other countries, of course.
Thank you. I wonder if you know about this one. Okay, what has France done in recent years to amend the revoking of citizenship to its Jews? And if I can add to that, has this history made it complicated for people to make property restitution requests?
No, because the law was totally cancelled. I mean, that's what I said. It was like the law did not existed because it was another regime. So because of that, they are considered absolutely as French. So no one, that is why a lot of them did not know if they are or not still French. Because if they were not notified with the withdrawal, they did not know. I'm getting almost every week an email from a person saying, my father, can you please look in your file if you find my father? Because I don't know if he was or not denaturalized. As soon as 2 days ago, I received this message from a grandson of a Spanish person who was denaturalized, in fact. And I found him and I said, and here is his file and you can see it. I mean, so they don't know, really. They discovered into the archive the story.
If you're willing to take one more question.
Yeah, sure.
Will you say something about this very surprising continuity of judges and administrators from the Vichy period into the post-war? Was the case that you showed typical, or was it very unusual? It was very surprising.
I think if you think that a new regime arrives how can it recruit just new persons? It's not possible. It's always like that. I mean, the persons are the same. You can see that in the communist transitions. You can see that in a lot of regimes, because, I mean, you need persons who know how to do. And here, they know the files. That's why they are just turning with the persons who were acting in the service to naturalize, because they know perfectly how to open a file, how to go quick. I mean, it's a huge amount of work, so they are very efficient. And then, after, about the post-war purges, I agree that Mornay was quite something. I mean, and if you know the small story about that, Robert Badinter, who was a former Ministry of Justice, he loved my book because of that, because he hated Mornay, because his own family was neutralized. And for him, Mornay was the incarnation, you say that, incarnation? Of the evil, because he was like going from one regime to another. And so he just like was so happy I mentioned him in his role, because no one says something about that, about this kind of, he's like oversaw the Pétain trial. Right. So he's like the big judge. And he was just 6 months before withdrawing, denaturalizing for 4 years, 5 years. So that is something very, at the same time, impressive, but you were talking about normal. I think it's quite normal that you need to have an administration and to learn how an administration works. It's not easy. I mean, so this is what happened. This is why we have to be quite vigilant about that. And this is why also, as a French civil servant, because I'm a civil servant in France, you always have this idea of what am I going to do? If something they ask me, I mean, to teach something I'm not easy with, if they're, I mean, so I think this is also something that I had in my head for pretty long time, to try to think about what, as a service servant, you have to do or not when you are facing such challenges.
Claire, thank you so much. You have given us so much to think about with this wonderful talk. I'd like to invite everyone now upstairs where we can ask Claire more of our questions. But before we do, please join me in thanking her once again. Thank you.